everybody, and good morning, good afternoon, whatever time you're watching this. I'm Saul, and I'm a historian primarily of the 18th and 19th centuries, but today we are joined by Harry, who's going to be telling us some more about the Tudors and answering some questions that have been sent in to us. But yes, Harry, would you like to introduce yourself, and then we'll jump into the Tudors from there?
Yeah, well, I'm Harry. I'm a historian of the 16th and 17th century in Britain and Europe. I have particular interests in the history of religion and the history of printing and the history of the book, and in particular the Tudors, which works very well for us today.
Great. So sort of getting started with really a question that makes me think back to when I was in school, and the Tudors were kind of really important. Everybody sort of knows about Henry VIII and his 6 wives, and maybe has a vague idea of some of the other things that went on during his reign. But why do the Tudors dominate so much of our attention?
That's right. I think the interesting thing about the Tudors is that they crop up at every part of the school curriculum. They are very often a period people will do at both GCSE and A level, and then continue on with, if perhaps they're doing history at university, and then people will continue to see TV programs and popular books and sort of history fiction writing about the Tudors. As someone who works on both the Tudor and Stuart period, it does surprise me to look at this another way, that the Stuart period doesn't grab more of our attention. The English Civil War, the killing of a king. There are a few films throughout, the last few decades. There are, reasonable number of history fiction texts, and yet the Tudors dominate. And I think it is because they are absolutely prime candidates, the Tudor monarchs, and indeed many Tudor noblemen and writers and figures, for dramatic historical narrative and dramatic history telling. They are in particular people that we know a considerable amount about in comparison to just a century or even a couple of decades before. They're figures who leave a lot of source material. They're figures who have a lot of source material written about them. In some cases, there's just so much source material generated that is one reason Tudors continue to dominate historical attention in the professional sense. Why do the Tudors dominate so much popular narrative and attention, from, I suppose, history magazines to history fiction? I think it is, again, that the drama, the sense of the many senses of crisis that happened throughout the Tudor period, and I guess some very relatable themes of family infighting, of romantic narratives, of dramatic beheadings and executions, of rebellions and riots. These things are, of course, evident in other periods, but I think they are densely evident in the Tudor period, and it therefore has grabbed our attention in so many ways. And I suppose some of the great monuments and landmarks of across Britain draw their roots back to the Tudor period, or were drastically changed and altered by Tudor monarchs. And then scars across the landscape that we can't help but see: the monasteries destroyed, the great families brought down. So I think it's simply that there is just so much to get our teeth into with the Tudors.
Yeah, it's sort of interesting, isn't it? Because I kind of have this childhood memory of Terry Deary and Horrible Histories, and this caricature of Henry VIII at the table just eating all the time. And then recently we've had the growth of Wolf Hall, and then its dramatization. So it's interesting how this sort of almost caricatured version of the Tudors has also continued alongside more rigorous academic scholarship that's been going on.
Absolutely.
Within that. Yeah, I'm also sort of following on from that. Why is it that even within the Tudors, there are monarchs that we prioritize and look into? So, for example, Henry VII, people, again, might have a somewhat of an idea about him, maybe the Battle of Bosworth Field, but then Henry VIII is this giant character which everybody knows about. Why do you think that is?
And Henry VII, is a founding dynasty member in the form of the Tudors. He's someone who puts a stop to the Wars of the Roses in most ways. He's someone who draws together a new regime, and yet as you say, he is often forgotten, or at least, very much overlooked. I said before that the Tudors dominate our attention because they leave so much source material behind them. And much of that is textual and written, but a great deal of it is visual. It is about, elaborate building programs at Hampton Court. It is about the fantastic artwork of, the Holbein portraits of Henry and his courtiers, or the fantastic images of Elizabeth. And Henry VII doesn't quite do that. Now, what's often said about Henry VII is that he's a sort of penny pincher. He sort of spends all of his time sat in a tower kind of counting his money. Well, Henry VII is certainly someone who has a good awareness of accountancy and bookkeeping and managing the finances of his kingdom. He is someone who understands the role of ceremony and of portraiture, but in a much more modest way than Henry VIII, who essentially comes to the throne and spends all of his father's hard-won money on being the splendid monarch who everybody sees. And, I suppose what's again interesting about the Tudors to me is how they cross over periodization, which is something we've spoken about many times on different videos and debates, which is that the Tudors cross over that sort of complex division between medieval and early modern. And we've said before, there are many problems with simply saying, well, in 1500, the medieval period ends and suddenly we're into something new. And Henry VII crosses that, coming to the throne in 1485 and then pushing through into the first decade of the 1500s. He crosses our normal way of dividing history up, and he therefore creates a bit of a problem. And he's seen much more as, in many ways, one of the last medieval kings instead of one of the first early modern or Renaissance kings. And I think for that reason sometimes falls between the cracks. And yet in kind of academic historical research, Henry VII is an incredibly vibrant subject. Henry VII's interest in securing his regime, in being quite creative with law, with tax, with foreign policy, the fact that Henry VIII goes on to marry the Spanish Princess Catherine of Aragon, well, that's all Henry VII's idea. This is Henry VII's way of building connections. So there's a lot to say about Henry VII, but I think he is just dominated in a sense by that large physical presence, quite literally, of Henry VIII, and does therefore tend to be forgotten. But I absolutely commend people who are interested in the Tudors to return to Henry VII, to some of the fantastic recent biographies and studies of him that have come out.
Are there any sort of highlights for you when we're talking about Henry VII that immediately come to mind that you think, well, I can't believe you mentioned a couple of them there, in terms of his tax reforms and legal reforms. Anything that comes to mind as thinking, wow, this guy, you need to go out and read us something about him, because otherwise you're going to be missing part of the key elements in the chain of history.
I mean, I suppose, Henry VII is dealing with not so much plentiful rebellion, though there is some rebellion, but with a tense uncertainty about his future. I said earlier, he brings an end to the Wars of the Roses. Well, that's something it's easy for us to say in hindsight. But for Henry VII, it seems entirely possible, indeed very likely, that the Wars of the Roses are simply going to continue. He has been a part of killing Richard III on the battlefield, and therefore bringing his sort of his Lancastrian heritage and bloodline to the throne. He's married into the Yorkist bloodline through Elizabeth of York, giving to us that fantastic Tudor rose, which we see on banners and heraldry across the country. So he brings together the red and the white rose. And this all sounds great, but there are plenty of people who still want to seize the throne from him. And I think it is that uncertainty and, in many sense, Henry VII's use of, on the one hand, diplomacy, and on the other hand, quite forceful avenues of putting down enemies that make him an especially interesting character, and someone who is quite creatively trying to problem solve, who is trying to use symbols and imagery. I guess a final thing that I think is overlooked about Henry VII is the role of other family members around Henry VII. I mentioned Elizabeth of York, but Lady Margaret Beaufort is a fantastic example of a powerful, sort of late medieval woman who understands politics, who is playing the game incredibly well, and again is a great figure to look at. She goes around not only ensuring that her son remains powerful, but founding colleges, endowing churches. She is a fantastic figure, full of interest and intrigue.
I struggle not to smile when thinking of Henry VII and the rebellions against him because of the book 1066 and all that, and that Lambert, Simnel, and Perkin Warbeck's names progressively become more and more ridiculous as the chapter goes on. But it sounds like there's a lot to jump into on Henry VII. But moving on to Henry VIII and that big character. So starting off, do you think that he was a tyrant? Would that be a fair description of him?
This opens up that question of, is Henry VIII's reign best treated as one period, or do we need to break it down? Do we need to split it up into different parts? So, Henry is on the throne from 1509 to 1547. So, 4 decades really of rule. And historians have argued, as historians often do, about whether we should divide his reign up. And one date that consistently comes out is 1536. And that some historians have tended to say from 1536 there is a changed man on the throne. And one reason, and again, one very particular reason that's drawn out for this is an accident that Henry has. A very nasty sporting accident in a joust. And this is an enormously scary moment for people around him. He's the king about to die and cause a succession crisis. But it's said that from then on, something has changed about Henry. He seems to become rather more violent, rather more prone to sort of pushing figures away from him quickly and rapidly deciding on quite drastic acts of execution, of exile from court, of pursuing his own policy against the advice of his ministers. I'm not entirely convinced by that. I think we can go back earlier and see traces of that, whether from 1536 things develop more rapidly, or Henry becomes kind of more entrenched in his attitudes to his right as a king to do what he wants. Actually, towards the end of the 1520s, Henry pushes away from him and allows to have sort of beaten into the ground and stripped of all his power and offices and driven to death someone who has served him loyally for over a decade, Thomas Wolsey. And Henry is caught between personal loyalty and wanting to be an almost infallible monarch. Henry is not good at saying, well, that didn't work, let's try something new. He's much better at saying, this person has let me down because they're a traitor. What we can say in terms of tyranny, of being a tyrant, which has a very particular meaning in many ways to historians and political theorists, is that Henry focuses in from the 1530s onwards on treason as being of something which really concerns him. So we get these series of treason acts. It means that just to talk about the king's death is treason, that to deny Henry is head of the church is treason, that to do so outside of England is treason, and on your return you must be treated as a traitor. To say that one of Henry's marriages, which he says didn't happen, happened, or to say that he in fact remains married to someone or doesn't, is treason. This is a kind of enormous broadening of what it means to be a traitor, and it speaks to a real concern within Henry. Another thing to think about in 1536 and in the 1530s is Henry's pursuit of a male heir. And for me, that is what is driving a lot of what Henry's doing that leads some people to conclude he's being a tyrant. For much of the 1530s, he's not got a male heir. He then has a pretty young and sickly one whose mother has died in childbirth. the future Edward VI. And so Henry starts to worry about what's going to happen if he dies. And I suspect that's where this nasty accident fits into things. Henry's mortality is kind of confronting him in the 1530s, and what he sees around him are many enemies waiting to seize the throne. And so he violently puts them down with the help of Thomas Cromwell. And so the Pole family and the Courtenay family are persecuted, I suppose. Now, it's very difficult for us to see how guilty they actually are, because the records we have been created by people whose job it was to find them guilty. So we're sort of a bit trapped as historians. Was Henry a tyrant then? I've been a bit roundabout there. I think in terms of his approach to his own authority and to criticism of him, from the 1530s onwards, he is exhibiting many telltale signs of a tyrant. But what I'm less convinced about is that we should pinpoint this change as firmly happening in the 1530s. I think there are many ways in which these behaviours are evident before then, but what changes in the 1530s, and one can see the human element of having a nasty accident, of having your mortality confront you, is that Henry becomes so much more worried about what's going to happen when he dies and whether or not he has a male heir to take over from him.
Thank you. It's sort of interesting as well, from a philosophical perspective, firstly, what is a tyrant and what counts as a tyrant, and then thinking about, secondly, that even if one says that somebody like Henry VIII was exhibiting tyrannical behavior, is there something that changes when that's justified compared to if we could conceive of either Henry in this circumstance or somebody else exhibiting tyrannical behavior without any seeming justification, and where does that justification come from? But I want to just ask about Thomas Wolsey, because you mentioned him there. Could you tell us a little bit more about him and what his role was, and perhaps why Henry decided that somebody that had served him loyally had to be persecuted as he was? And
Wolsey is someone who has interested me for a long time, because he again is the last of something, really. He's in many ways the last of the all-powerful churchman who dominates both church and politics in a way that just doesn't really happen again. Even when we get to kind of, someone like Archbishop William Laud under Charles I, that they're not comparable. And that's because Thomas Wolsey comes to be described as an alter rex, as the other king, and his power and the way in which he presents himself gets to the point where he's rivaling Henry. And yet, Wolsey is born in 1473 to a humble Ipswich family of butchers, and his rise to the top is therefore very remarkable. Now, I guess it's worth saying that we can play on the fact that he comes from this humble origin too much. The church has long offered people from the lower classes a way of rising, because when you enter the church, when you become a priest, maybe you hope to rise to be rather more and become a dean or a bishop, that is your identity, and your kind of previous social status matters a bit less in the church. So the church has long been a way that people can rise up beyond their birth. But Wolsey's is quite the remarkable rise. And, it is to a large extent because he's an incredibly impressive scholar and bureaucrat. He impresses people in Oxford and comes to the attention of the king when the king is going to war with France and needs someone to organise very practical things, but things which in war make a difference. Do you have a good supply of food, of water, of ammunition? Do you have your retreat plan ready, etc.? And Wolsey proves himself to be incredibly competent. And from there, his rise is assured. He becomes Archbishop of York. And because the Archbishop of Canterbury is in charge of the English Church, Wolsey covets that position, but someone else has it. It's not easy to kick someone out. So Wolsey becomes a cardinal. He leapfrogs over and becomes that relatively rare thing, an English cardinal of the Catholic Church, someone with incredible power and authority, therefore not just in his own country, but in European politics. And from there, Wolsey is negotiating peace settlements between England and France, and Spain and the Holy Roman Empire, and gathering an enormous amount of wealth because he's gathering title upon title upon title. I mentioned earlier Hampton Court. Hampton Court is Wolsey's residence. It's developed and embellished by him and taken over by the crown in the wake of Wolsey's fall from power. I've said Wolsey becomes the Alter Rex. This becomes a problem for Wolsey in many ways because it starts to present him as no longer a servant, but as a kind of rival to the king. And one of the great Tudor poets, a very playful poet, John Skelton, talks about Wolsey's court as rivaling the king's court in a poem called Why Go Ye Not to Court? And Skelton says, why go ye not to court? To which court? To the king's court? No, to the cardinal's court, to Hampton Court. So, Wolsey is dominating. He's rivaling the wealth and power of the king, and Henry is a jealous man. Why does Wolsey fall from power? Well, Wolsey falls from power, I suppose, from reasons which are two sides of the same coin. On the one hand, it's because he has attracted the hatred of Anne Boleyn, who towards the end of Wolsey's life is rapidly rising in the king's favour. And he's sort of attracted the hatred of Anne Boleyn partly because he's had dealings with her in the past and with her family, but also because he has failed to secure a divorce or an annulment for Henry and his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, which would allow Anne Boleyn to marry him. And Anne has committed herself to not becoming simply one of the king's many mistresses, but to becoming a queen. And she needs Wolsey to sort this out. The problem is that Wolsey may be a cardinal, he may be a very clever man, he may be an excellent bureaucrat, but when the whole tide of European politics is turned against him, he can't deliver the impossible, which is the annulment Henry wants. And as a result of that, he's pushed out of the way, he's sidelined, his enemies, many of which are, noble-born high political figures like the Duke of Norfolk, who have long detested Wolsey as the butcher's boy who has taken from them all of the wealth and power they should have had. And so, in a way, all the things that had made Wolsey great and effective and powerful towards the end of his life make him very vulnerable and very much open to the horrible and rapid sea changes that the Tudor court brings. So Wolsey is a prime example of how, in order to do well in Henry's England, you have to have his favour. And no matter how powerful you are, if you lose his favour, well, you lose your position and status. And although Wolsey in the end was not executed, but died, impoverished on the road, it seems likely that had he have come back to London as he was eventually being commanded to do, that he would indeed have been tried for probably treason and executed as such.
Thank you. That's fascinating insight into what sounds like a fascinating life. I think, when we talk about Wolsey and then talking about England of that time and also perhaps reflecting on the very recent election of a new pope, this is also the reign that we see the break in England from the Catholic Church, which then goes on to shape England and Britain for perhaps until the modern day. So why does that happen? Why does Henry VIII break from the Catholic Church?
Yes, well, I suppose the narrative that's often told is Henry wants a new wife, he wants Anne Boleyn, and he can't get that. We've said Thomas Wolsey can't deliver that through the Catholic Church, so he says, okay, I'll just have my own church and have my own way, which I suppose, like many kind of rapid narrative summaries, has elements of truth in it, but also misses out a lot, which is that Henry VIII is a very spiritual, a very pious king. he's also someone who's theologically interested. So he's not just interested in, following orders of prayer and being a pious Christian in that sense. He's interested in understanding Christian theology and why Christians should do what they do. And as a result of that, Henry is sort of in touch with important Christian reformers, people who want to reform the church, who want to perfect it. And for that kind of reformer, for someone like Erasmus, you're perfecting the church from within. You're not breaking away from the Catholic Church. That seems almost unthinkable. You're simply saying that we need to improve what we're doing. We need to get rid of the kind of unnecessary ceremony. We need to get rid of maybe a focus on money. We need to get rid of unnecessary power structures and return to a kind of purer Christian practice. But what's also happening in the early 1500s is this developing new movement, which would come to be called Protestantism. And so what we have are Catholics who want to reform the church from within, these Protestants, or at the time evangelicals as they're being called, who are trying to start something new. And Henry's divorce is kind of happening in this period. It's happening in this context. And Henry can never really quite make up his mind where he sits between these groups. And so for this reason, Henry has sometimes been called a Catholic without the Pope. In other words, what he's done is say, I'm breaking away from the Catholic Church because the Pope won't give me the annulment I want. I'll make myself Pope of my new little church in England, and then I can do what I want. And yet, within England, there are people who see this break from Rome as an opportunity to go much further, to do the kinds of things these evangelical Protestants are interested in, to, for instance, get rid of monasteries, which Henry goes on to do. And there opens a considerable argument about why Henry VIII, someone who founds monasteries, eventually gets rid of 800 of them. Now, one answer might be money and wealth, for these are fantastically wealthy institutions. Another answer might feed back to what we were saying before about how Henry becomes very concerned about rebellion and disloyalty, and he sees these monasteries as pockets of loyal monks to Rome. This is the problem with Henry and the break from the Catholic Church, that although this is a national, political, religious shift, it's being directed to a great extent by the whims of someone, a King Henry, who has yet to fully make up his mind about where he actually sits between Catholic and Protestant theology and doctrine. There are bits of the Protestant Protestant political and religious theory he's drawn towards. That is to say, the Pope isn't important, but there are bits he absolutely despises and will happily execute people for believing. So to answer the question why Henry broke from the Catholic Church, the catalyst is absolutely the annulment, and that he is not being given what he wants. To finish with a counterfactual, though, had Henry have been given his annulment by the Pope, in 1529, 1530, and been able to marry Anne Boleyn, to send Catherine of Aragon off into a nunnery or back home to Spain, I think what we can say is it's still very likely that the English Church would have undergone some form of transformation in this period, because Henry is interested in reform. But of course, that would look very different than what actually transpired, which is a Church of England cut off from Rome doing its own thing. So like most things with Henry, it's his own policy, his own feeling and emotion, which is driving forward something much bigger.
Yeah, because it's an interesting question, isn't it? The interplay between geopolitical concerns or domestic concerns as well on the one side, and this realpolitik, or the purpose of the state, compared to theological issues and the blurring of the boundaries between the two of them. Because you have Henry, as you've just explained, having theological interests, but also having purposes that are more developed than that. And I suppose that's also going on, isn't it, for the Pope himself. So on the one hand, he's got a theological question of, can Henry VIII marry Catherine of Aragon if she's was married to Henry's brother, and what is the theological resolution there? But then also Charles V is marching around Italy with an army, isn't he? And he's Catherine of Aragon's nephew, and is probably not very happy that Anne is about to get shunted over to the side by...
Absolutely.
So
we've said, we're in a period where we've elected a new pope. The pope remains an incredibly important figure in this period, and yet this is also a period in which the pope is being held captive in Rome at various times. This is a period where popes are, both spiritual leaders, but they're also, in charge of large quantities of land in Italy, and in the same way Henry's caught between the kind of spiritual, theological and the political reality of early modern Europe, so is the Pope. And, in a different context, in a different period, it might have been possible for some negotiation to have been found. Kings have had annulments before, but in the context of as you say, of Emperor Charles not being terribly happy about his aunt being kicked off the throne, this is not likely to have happened in that period, absolutely.
Yeah, and that's another sort of interesting thought that I was actually having last week. I was reading 100 years later in the 17th century with the Glorious Revolution and the decision that is made by a group of English nobles that they don't want James II to be king, and part of that is that he has become a Catholic. And then there's also an interesting sort of assessment by historians of the percentages in the country of people that are either Catholic or Protestants. And you see people that are traditionally themselves Protestant saying there might be a few thousand here and there, perhaps as many as 20,000, but the numbers don't really get much higher than that. Then you do have families like the Dukes of Norfolk who traditionally have remained Catholic. And then you get often Catholic historians on the other side saying, it's probably 15% of the population that still retains at least an interest in Catholicism, even if they have to practice in an Anglican way. And there's another question in this period, is there any way to even know what people themselves are interested in doing? Would you have any thoughts about that?
Well, I think when Henry breaks from the Catholic Church at first, most people are fairly sure this is not going to last for very long, that this is a very big hissy fit from a man who is prone to these kinds of rash decisions. And, as a result, people are sort of following the new rules, but they're hiding away things that Henry says to get rid of in the expectation that in a few years' time they'll bring them back out. Rather than ripping pages out of books, they're pasting bits of paper over them, ready to peel them back in a few years' time. That is the kind of mentality of people in the early 1530s, which is that, this is utter madness. The Catholic Church is, ancient, it's universal, it's powerful. It simply cannot be got rid of from England in this way. And there's an expectation that over time, Henry and a pope will kind of cool down and come to some negotiation. And again, there are, to a lesser extent than this, historical examples of that happening. Kings and popes fall out, they make up again. And as a result of that, this is something that passes many people by. The actual reality of going to your local church hasn't changed an awful lot by 1534 compared to 1524. It's in the years after, towards the end of the 1530s, into the 1540s, when things start to change, and when people, I suppose at a more common popular level, start to realize quite a lot has in fact changed. The dissolution of the monasteries is huge. Various saints have been gotten rid of. People who Henry doesn't like Thomas Becket, because he's a saint who challenged royal authority. The king has overseen the introduction of an English Bible, and change has started to happen in a more profound way. That of course is very difficult to measure in terms of, are these people Catholic or Protestant? And in this point of time, we can't do that. They're not necessarily either, because what Henry's demanding of them is to accept that he is head of the church, And many people try and find a way of doing that, which still enables them to believe every other bit of kind of Catholic theology. So they say, okay, well, I don't believe in all the other Protestant stuff, but I have to acknowledge Henry as head of the church in order to be alive. And of course, for many people, that doesn't change their daily life very much at all. You've substituted one name for another in many ways. Popular belief is, of course, the hardest thing to measure in this period, in a period of relatively low literacy, and in a period in which it's just not the kind of thing people write down for fear that it might lead to them being punished.
Yeah. I wonder if there's also a conversation that is not quite resolved for a very long time in Britain. Even in the 19th century, there are debates about high church and low church. And then there are different groups that break off. But you've talked a lot about what's going on internally within Henry's court and within the government. Would you say that this constitutes a revolution in Tudor government?
Mm-hmm. So this is a long-running dispute between Tudor historians, or historians of the Stuart period too, and how it flows on. And it begins with a great historian of the period called Geoffrey Elton, who comes up with the idea that in the 1530s there is a revolution in Tudor government. And this is partly to do with bureaucracy, with the rise of sort of departments really that have particular responsibilities, to the increased role of ministers in the form of the Privy Council, who, I mean, it's an awkward comparison, but we can imagine that there are similarities with the kind of modern day cabinet, the most important ministers who gather together and have particular responsibilities. This is also about the increased presence of Parliament, for Parliament is sitting very often in the 1530s, giving their opinion on a much wider range of things. This is also to do with the sort of extent of government and how government starts to penetrate the localities, how it starts to spread much further into Wales, into Ireland, into how the central state is trying to control what goes on in the locality. So there is certainly a great amount of change. The word which draws the debate is revolution. And, we've spoken about revolutions in different contexts. It's a word that historians on the one hand really like to use, but also really like to say, maybe it's not quite a revolution, maybe it's something else. So one thing historians have done is to take the R away and to talk about the evolution of Tudor government and how this is more of a long-term process, because, I suppose traditional ways of using the word revolution are literally that something has revolved and gone upside down. And I think that's not quite what's happened. What there is a massive increase in government activity, in paperwork, in the kind of remit that central government feels it has. And actually, a lot of this is to do with religious change, that, the English kind of royal machinery is now having to take on the running of a church too. I mentioned the dissolution of the monasteries, dissolving, hundreds and hundreds of wealthy institutions and redistributing that wealth, of cataloguing it, of selling it, of reassigning it, of ensuring that legal papers are distributed, is an incredible work incredible feat, really, to have achieved so quickly. And it's one of the reasons why these new little offices and departments start to grow. This is also a period in which foreign policy is developing much more. So the role of ambassadors is growing. This is a period in which, although there are not standing armies, there are changes in the way in which armies are raised, the kind of development of royal navies. All of this requires tax, money, paperwork, parliamentary acts, Privy Council letters, and everything just starts to grow and spiral. And a very visual way of looking at this is to go to a good old-fashioned library where everything is printed out, and to look at the legal acts for the 15th century, and to see how even just in the reign of Henry VIII, the volume of material being produced dwarfs that comes, for the whole century before. It is just an enormous amount of stuff being generated. And I think in that sense, it's possible to see that for people at the time, something revolutionary might have been going on, that the way in which they interact with government and government interacts with them seems to have changed.
No, thank you. And then sort of to wrap up with Henry VIII, because there's one big figure that we haven't talked about too much who dominates Henry's later reign and then is eventually executed. So could you tell us a little bit about Thomas Cromwell, also perhaps the star, at least of some of Wolf Hall? Not that I've seen it, but I think I always see somebody representing him whenever I see trailers or things like that. But who is Thomas Cromwell? What happens to him, and why does he end up being executed?
Well, Thomas Cromwell, has sort of similarities with Thomas Wolsey in the sense he comes from a low background. So Cromwell is the son of a blacksmith and a beer brewer in Putney. And Cromwell comes to the attention of Wolsey. So their stories are intertwined, these two Thomases. Cromwell comes to the attention of Wolsey as being a very capable fixer, as someone who can get the job done, as someone who you probably don't want to know how they got the job done, because it may not be entirely legal or moral, but the job will get done. And that's all Henry wants to know, is that it's got done. So Cromwell becomes very useful. When Wolsey falls from power, Cromwell remains loyal, really, to Wolsey and tries to find a way for Wolsey to come back. And as a result of this, he's petitioning the king. He meets the king, and meeting the king is very often the beginning of someone's rise to power. If you impress Henry, things are going to go well for you, and that's what happens with Cromwell. The absence the absence of a dominant political minister created by Wolsey's fall leaves a gap for someone to fill. Because ultimately, Henry, although he becomes more interested in politics over time, certainly at the start of his reign, he's a young man. He's more interested in sort of playing with his friends, really, in hunting, in feasting. By the 1530s, he is more interested in government, but he doesn't want to be doing all of the paperwork. He needs a right-hand man, and Cromwell fills that gap. And what Cromwell has learnt from Wolsey and from both Wolsey's successes and failures is how to do well with Henry. And Cromwell becomes aware that he must not become an alter rex. He must not be seen as someone who's trying to rival the king's power and authority. So although Cromwell is very wealthy, and does still show off, he's much less of a show-off than Wolsey was. Cromwell's problem is that by the late 1530s, when his position is becoming much more unstable, his problem is that Henry has become very changeable in his religious policy, and that Cromwell has kind of increasingly tied himself to a reform party, really, or to a reformed way of thinking. It's Cromwell who's helped oversee the introduction of English Bibles, something which just 10, 15 years before Henry had said, I absolutely hate them, absolutely not. Cromwell has overseen this remarkable U-turn. Cromwell has overseen the dissolution of the monasteries. Cromwell has overseen various types of reform of the church, and has given himself the title Vicar General to enable him to do this. Unlike Wolsey, he's not a churchman, he's not a bishop, he's not a priest. He gives himself that title. The problem really comes, or the turning point comes, with the failure of the Cleves marriage, the failed marriage between Henry and Anne of Cleves. For Cromwell, the reason he has pursued this marriage is that Cleves, a pretty small German state, is Protestant or favouring Protestantism. And Cromwell sees this as a good way of ensuring, a kind of an alliance between England and another regime who have gone against the Pope. The problem is Henry is just not impressed with Anne of Cleves at all. The traditional story is that he simply doesn't find her pretty, that he thinks she looks like a German horse, which is kind of classically Henry in its cuttingness. I think that's part of it. But the other part of it is he feels that Cromwell has started to do maybe what Wolsey was doing and exceeding his authority. That in creating this marriage, he has offered things to Cleves that Henry doesn't want to do. And much as it was with Wolsey, people who feel that they've lost out on political power and wealth because of Cromwell pile on in and accuse him of being a traitor and a heretic. And Henry is someone who goes with the crowd. If there are 12 people around him saying Cromwell's a traitor, it doesn't matter that Cromwell served him well for a decade. Henry starts to listen to that. And yes, the result is that even though Cromwell had been raised to the title of an earl just a matter of months before his death, in 1540, he too is executed, in a place where Anne Boleyn, Thomas More, all the figures that Cromwell had helped have executed himself were executed. There's a kind of fitting irony to his end, and the Cromwell name disappears really. Cromwell's son is not a great political figure, and the name just disappears. But as we've said, the legacy of Cromwell remains a very strong one, and one that in popular imagination is just so enticing and so engaging.
Great, thank you. Yes, I agree. His name on a personal level disappears, but of course we do have another Cromwell 100 years later. That's probably
historians have tried to create links. Dermot McCulloch, who's written a fantastic biography of Thomas Cromwell. It's possible there's some very, very distant connection, but actually it's of no interest to Oliver Cromwell to present himself as being linked to Thomas Cromwell. But no, I mean, there's an interesting book perhaps to compare the two people and their lives waiting to happen. Yes.
Great, thank you. So let's just jump to the next Tudor monarch, Henry's son by his third wife, Edward VI. And I think you could sort of present this in two ways, couldn't you? It could either be this 6-year period of just a young boy becoming a king, but there are some fairly significant things that happen as well, aren't there? So what do you think? Should we consider Edward VI's reign as a reign of historical importance?
Absolutely. I mean, I think, the problem of focusing on Henry and Elizabeth is that we sometimes treat Edward and Mary as a kind of brief hiatus between the two great figures. Actually, Edward's reign is of incredible importance to the way in which England develops, politically and religiously. It's in Edward's reign that England becomes Protestant. It's in Edward's reign that worship starts happening in English, that major theological change starts to happen, that Catholicism is being, actively gotten rid of, that churches are whitewashed, that images are burnt, that enormous change starts to happen. We talk about Edward, the reign of Edward VI. Edward is king, he's the anointed king, but he's also a boy in this period. And as a result, there are regents, two regents. One, or the first, is his uncle, Somerset, the Duke of Somerset, who gives himself the title of Lord Protector. And it is Somerset who is overseeing the show in this early period of Edward's reign. It's Somerset who is acting really as the king, who is issuing royal commands. And then after that, we have a second regent, Northumberland, who, in a different way, is tackling the problem of regency at the point at which Edward dies. And that's when we get the Lady Jane Grey fiasco, where Edward dies unmarried without an heir, without an obvious Protestant heir, and Northumberland tries to bring in this young girl, Jane Grey, to take over. Edward's reign is often forgotten about and sort of lumped into this general mid-Tudor period. But if I were to pick up a few defining characteristics, it's a period in which the role of the Privy Council becomes obvious to everybody, that actually it is a group of educated university men who are knowledgeable of law, of accountancy, who are able to speak many languages and run complex diplomatic missions, who are in fact at the core of Tudor government. And that while these great aristocratic families are culturally important and have a political role to play, they are no longer the driving force of Tudor government. Tudor government has become too complex to be run by someone who wants to spend 80% of their time hunting. What you now need are full-time, almost civil servant-like figures who spend all day, every day, responding to letters from localities, managing parliament, drafting legislation, dealing with the enormous volume of correspondence coming in from abroad, and writing back likewise. It's a period in which this becomes especially obvious because of the absence of a dominant king figure. We see that much more obviously. The second, and if I were to pick on one religious change that's of monumental importance, the introduction of worship in English. It transforms the relationship of ordinary people with their church. It forces them to sit down in pews, looking forwards towards a minister and to engage with them. If you were to go to an Anglican church in England to get today, there are enormous similarities with how worship would be happening. The language may sound different, but the call and response, the interaction of minister and person is being developed in the Edwardian period by someone called Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury. And a final one, a final reason that I think the reign is of importance, well, I think it's a period that shows us how resilient the Tudor regime has in fact become. When we think back to Henry VII, who we spoke about earlier, the presence of a young boy king in the Wars of the Roses would have spelled enormous trouble. It would have spelled catastrophe in terms of rival figures popping up and trying to claim the throne, battles to steal the crown. None of this happens. Instead, England presents itself, even when it's in theory being ruled by a boy, as a strong, competent royal machinery and government. And therefore, what I think is so important or so useful about the reign of Edward is it's a kind of way of measuring, of comparing how much things have changed in just a short period of time. And there are lots of fantastic studies at Edward. I'd recommend McCulloch's study, which really focuses in on what is extremely novel and what is a kind of a period with a lasting legacy. So no, absolutely, Edward's reign is of historical importance.
Thank you. I've heard this phrase bandied about of a mid-Tudor crisis. Could you explain a little bit about what that term signifies?
Yeah.
Whether it is an accurate description of what is going on?
I mean, the mid-Tudor crisis, I suppose we could say, what was the mid-Tudor crisis? Some historians would now start to say, was there a mid-Tudor crisis? Is this all just a kind of fabrication? Is this all just a kind of one way of thinking which may not be very helpful? I think the basic assumption behind there being a mid-Tudor crisis is that there is a fairly rapid changeover of power of monarchs, that this is a period of religious crisis in terms of dispute between Catholic and Protestant sides, that this is a period where there are a reasonably dense number of rebellions. The Pilgrimage of Grace in 1536, where people rebel against Henry's closure of the monasteries. Then the rebellions under Edward, one protesting against worship in English, One slightly more complex in its origin, but pretty economic in its basis. Then there is the Lady Jane Grey affair, this kind of attempt to put someone on the throne in a way that is not very convincing to many people and leads to her being on the throne for a matter of days before being executed. Then there are rebellions under Mary, both in terms of her Catholicism and of her marriage to the King of Spain. And then under Elizabeth, in the early years, there is instability. This is also a period of warfare in the 1540s, costly wars with France under the reign of Edward, quite sort of tricky military campaigns with the Scottish. Under Mary, again, war with France and the loss of Calais. This is a period, therefore, when we have lots of war, we have lots of tax. We therefore have economic decline in many areas. That's the logic of the crisis, that there just seems to be a lot of stuff going on that's not very helpful. And yet, I suppose this relates to what I said before with the reign of Edward. If this is a period of crisis, the fact that Elizabeth comes out of this as one of the strongest rulers in English history suggests that if there is a crisis, it's a transitory one, that the kind of core of the Tudor state must be remaining very strong if it can survive all of this stuff. So I don't remain, convinced that there is a mid-Tudor crisis. I think there are a series of rebellions that are pretty much put down and silenced quickly. There is economic crisis that takes a long while to resolve. There is religious dispute. But I don't think we should see this period as the mid-Tudor crisis. I think, on the other hand, this is a period of rapid change. And we don't have to think about that as crisis.
Yeah, it's very similar to that conversation that we hinted at before, isn't it? Of sort of taking a term which has preconceptions and it has ideas behind it, and then saying, well, can we take almost this checklist of ideas that would then define a period as something, or define a king as a tyrant, to use what we just discussed before, or define change of government as revolution, and then can we tack it on, can we stick it to that specific personal period and say, does that checklist match up with what I'm presuming it should have on it? So,
Absolutely. And, it's a term that sticks around because it has some use. I don't believe that there was a constant mid-Tudor crisis, but, I can still see a way in which that term could be useful to me. And that's the problem, isn't it, with these sorts of terms, that they're tempting to use, even if they don't perfectly sum up what we're in fact trying to say.
Well, there's a value, isn't there? And if it triggers thoughts, and if it helps us to explore and develop our understanding of something, then there's a value in doing so. Well, thank you everybody for listening. I hope you've learned something about the first half of the Tudors, and we'll be back sometime soon to give you that second half and then to explore any further questions that people have. Harry, I don't know if you have any thoughts just about all of that material that we've covered today, perhaps some pointers for people to explore a little more.
I think what we've covered is a huge amount of people, of historiographical debates, which I hope will prove useful for people who've listened to get a sense of how historians have to weave together the lives of people with important political and economic change, and how we come up with kind of theories that help us do that. Revolution in government, mid-Tudor crisis, and how that can open up avenues for us, but also can cause problems, conceptual problems. I think what we've also shown, going back to what we said at the start, why has the Tudor period dominated so much attention over the years? Why does it continue to? These are incredibly interesting people. They're people whose lives take unusual and dramatic courses. And thanks to the source material they're people who we feel we can understand and, dare I say, even relate to at times. I think with Thomas Cromwell, that's been part of the success of his story. We feel we can understand the predicament he's going through and relate to some of the kind of stress of his political life. So, yeah, I think we've covered a huge amount, and we've shown that this early Tudor period, including the reign of Edward and of Henry VII, are worthy of attention, and that perhaps those who have long been interested in Henry VIII might think about looking before to his father or after to his son, and thinking about where Henry fits into that bigger picture.
Well, everybody, thank you so much for joining us and watching. Thank you very much, and we'll see you soon.
Bye-bye.